All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So, my
Okay.
name is Cameron Feaster. I'm the wolf specialist here at the International Wolf Center. And today here at the International Wolf Center, we are proud to host Rolf Peterson, who is speaking to us about the wolf moose study on Isle Royale. He got his bachelor's degree in zoology from the University of Minnesota, his PhD in wildlife ecology from Purdue, and he began leading the project on Isle Royale in the early 1970s. He still works on it to this day. And so, Rolf, I think today we are just going to be going through your presentation that you mentioned before. And at the end of that presentation, we'll have a Q&A session. And to the audience, we do have a Q&A button near the bottom of the screen. If you are on a computer, you'll probably see a Q&A button. Feel free to send your questions in at any time during the presentation. At the end, during our Q&A session, I'll relay these questions to Rolf. You can also ask during that time frame as well. And if there's anything that we've already gone through that you have a question of, I'll just answer it via text so we don't repeat information. But I'll be relaying all the new questions to you, Rolf, and then we'll continue with that for the hour that we have. So thank you very much for participating with us, Rolf, and I'll let you take it away.
Okay. I guess we may as well start with the first slide there, which I can't see yet, but
Yeah, no problem. I'll change that right over for you.
as most of you are probably aware, Isle Royale is about to lose the wolf population that it's had for the last 60 years or so. And we're learning pretty quickly that that's having some profound effects on the entire island. So I thought I'd try and focus on what it means to have wolves on Isle Royale from the standpoint of the ecosystem. And I'll get into some detail, and most of the detail has nothing to do with wolves, but more to do with the prey animals, and particularly the vegetation of the island. Next slide, Kim. The basic reason why Isle Royale wolves are in trouble is there are no ice bridges to speak of these days. Ice bridges that used to connect Isle Royale to the mainland would form in the 1960s about 8 years out of 10, and lately it's about 1 year out of 10. And occasionally, like every 20, 30 years, a wolf would cross that ice bridge and become a new breeder on Isle Royale. It's a pretty rare event, but it's vital to maintaining the genetic integrity of that wolf population. So we know it's happened twice in almost 60 years. And the second time in 1997 is particularly well documented. And that is having ecological ramifications today. And it's pretty easy to see it in the vegetation. So without renewed genetic integrity, what's happened is the wolf population has declined because of inbreeding depression, poor reproduction, basically, and the population has sunk to just 2 animals the last 2 years, and we know now in October 2017 there's at least one of them still left because we caught it on a trail cam just a couple weeks ago. We don't have any solid evidence that there's 2 wolves, but certainly that's possible. Next slide. This is not a new problem for the National Park Service. Isle Royale had moose without any predators for almost a half century since they got there early in the 1900s. And by the 1940s, the problem had become fairly acute to the point where the director of the National Park Service was in touch with leading conservationists of the United States, including Aldo Leopold, on what to do. So in this slide, it shows that this is back in the days when people typed letters and sent them with a stamp on them. And what appears at the bottom is Leopold's response to the director of the Park Service, who said, okay, although you've been talking about putting wolves on Isle Royale for quite a while, now tell us more about it. And so Leopold reiterates on reducing wolves to Isle Royale, he's very heartily approved of it in order to conserve the wolf and stabilize moose. The two go naturally hand in hand. And as usual, Leopold was like a half century ahead of everybody else. But quickly, other conservationists weighed in on the issue, and Sigurd Olsen, Olis Muri, Adolf Muri, let's see who else. Let's see. Well, those are the big names, I guess. They all supported the introduction of wolves on Isle Royale to avoid the kind of devastating die-off and destruction of vegetation which happened in the 30s when moose hit their initial very high level. Next slide. What wolves basically do around the world when there are wolves is depress the density of their primary prey. And what this graph shows, as you go from 0 to 1 predators to 2 to more than 2, the ungulates per square kilometer go down from 10 to 15 down to less than 6 with 2 predators, which would usually be bears and wolves. And then when you have more than 2, like bears, wolves, and people, you usually have 1 or 2 prey animals per square kilometer or less. Now the green X's are white-tailed deer, and they always occur at higher densities because they're small. And then the blue dots show what happened to Yellowstone as time went on after wolves were added to Yellowstone in 1995, 1996. Progressively, the elk population, which was pushing the limit of animal density, prey density anywhere in the world, progressively dropped down to the point where recently it's almost down there to where we would kind of expect it, given that there are certainly more than 2 carnivores present in Yellowstone. So the bottom line is adding more and more large carnivores, including people, tends to reduce prey density. So that has profound implications. Next slide. So this is the long chronology of wolves and moose on Isle Royale, and we're going to be talking mostly about the last 10 years or so, 1995 on. And prior to that, there were some major fluctuations that started with wolves dying off in early 80s from canine parvovirus, and that released the moose from control by wolves, and then they reached the high point by 1995, and then they crashed in 1996 from starvation. And then what happened after that is extremely important. And if you follow the green line to roughly 2005 or so, you see about 7 years when the moose population was held down by wolves at about 1 per square kilometer. That's a pretty important number. 1 per square kilometer is a pretty sparse moose population. It's still 5 times what the average density of moose in Minnesota is, but for Isle Royale, it's relatively low. And that led to a lot of important changes across the island. Next slide. So this is the only wolf slide I have, I think, so better soak it up if you're interested in seeing wolves. In 1997, a new male, showed up on Isle Royale. We don't know where he was from, but his label was the old gray guy, or M93. And he got into a breeding slot, very fortunate for him, the very next year, and reproduced with a native female. And they had a big bunch of pups, and that pack quickly became the biggest pack that we'd seen in well over a decade. And that started the ball rolling for a new sort of a genetic sweep of his genes taking over the whole island. Within 3 years, he had offspring breeding in all the resident packs on the island, and within 9 years, every wolf on the island that was still alive was a direct descendant of his. Let's see, I think I'll go into the next slide. We'll come back if there's questions. And then within a few short years, predation rate increased to the highest level we'd ever seen. Let me see if I can, roughly 2004 to 2009, lined in pink up there, the predation rate hit an average of about 20% a year. What that means is that wolves were killing 20% of the moose every year. That's a phenomenal kill rate. And what that did was force the moose population down to that low level of about 1 per square kilometer. And then very suddenly, about 2012, the wolf population collapsed from genetic inbreeding. So we have a sort of a before and after picture of going from very heavy wolf predation to almost none. And that's a very instructive contrast, actually. Next slide. Beaver are an important secondary prey for wolves on Isle Royale. And beaver what we do is to kind of keep track of the beaver population is do an aerial count of beaver food piles or active beaver colonies each October. We did annual counts from 2006 to 2010, and then every 2 years since then. And beavers have basically gone off the top of the chart. More beaver colonies present now than any time, probably for 200 years, because beavers were largely wiped out across North America 200 years ago from the fur trade. So they're taking over the island in ways that we've never seen before. It's very interesting. Next slide. But the implications for vegetation have mostly to do with what moose do to the plants that they eat. And so what I'm describing here is a trophic cascade where wolves have indirectly affected the vegetation that's eaten by the primary prey. So wolves affect moose, keep moose at low levels, and that frees up vegetation, releases that from limitation by moose feeding. So we've got a good terrestrial example and a good aquatic example. So I'll get into the details of those. And then, but you got to think back, keep remembering this is all due to one wolf that arrived on the island. Next slide. So this, at the west end of Isle Royale, this is what the average regenerating balsam fir tree looks like. It's just completely beat up by moose. And the two stems on the left there, they were 40 to 50 years old. Browse fir can live in this situation for 60, 65 years. And when you look at across the landscape, you see a scene like on the right there, where they're just browse sticks in the snow. And that's what would become a new fir forest. And fir trees don't last more than about 100 years. So, and moose have been on Isle Royale for 100 years. So the canopy of fir trees that has existed for most of the 20th century is largely gone. And the next generation has been suppressed to the point where it can't grow up and replace its parents. So that was sort of the status quo for the last half century. And I never thought it would ever change. Next slide. What it looks like on the ground is on the right. As the canopy of the forest disappears just from getting old and trees dying, there's nothing to replace those old trees, and it reverts to grass. And this situation was studied by a couple of botanists, and they published a study in 2015. And you look on the map on the right, all those areas in black are what they call moose savannas, areas of grass. It's invasive grass that comes in the absence of tree growth. And once that mat of grass is established, trees can't penetrate it. Seeds can't start growing in that grass. So it's sort of permanently reverted to a spruce grassland. And the spruce trees are now getting hit by a bark beetle. So even the spruce trees are disappearing. So this is the long-term future of Isle Royale, at the west end particularly, is loss of the forest, literally, and production of spruce and grass, which certainly moose don't eat, and herbivores generally don't eat. Next slide. This shows how it happens. A matched repeated photograph taken in 1997 and then in 2015, almost 20 years later. What you see is fewer trees as you went through that time span, and more grass. And that's exactly what over the span of decades produces a totally different ecosystem, one that won't support many moose. Next slide. And looking in the forest on the left, this is what a West End forest looks like, a thick, dark, canopy of overstory trees, and then little stubs of balsam fir trying to grow but not able to because of the shade, basically, and because of the intensive moose herbivory. But on the right, much to our surprise, we started in around 3-4 years ago seeing some of these balsam fir stubs actually growing for the first time. And this was a huge surprise. And so we tried to get a handle on that, because the future of the forest at the West End depends on whether these trees grow up and produce seeds of their own someday. Next slide. So this is a lot of data here. I'll try and explain this. But the blue line is for balsam fir, the trees in the canopy of the forest that produce the seeds that would regenerate the tree. They've declined, and these are tag trees that we've been following for almost 30 years. They're about 95% dead. And as those trees die off, the seed source disappears as well. But the gray bars show the number of saplings, fir saplings that were escaping moose for the first time. And they peaked right around 2008, right in the middle of that period when moose were held to a very, very low level by intensive wolf predation. And as soon as those trees escape moose for a year, they start growing, putting on height growth. And we start paying attention to those trees when they hit 175 centimeters, which is roughly head high for me. And it's not safe for moose at that level, but the tree has a fair chance of surviving if it doesn't get browsed by moose. So the red line shows the tremendous increase in the number of those trees on this one long transect that we run. So there's real hope that those trees would grow up and maintain the forest of Isle Royale, but it's a race right now between growth of those trees and growth of the moose population, because moose are now increasing about 20% a year, which means they're going to double every 3 to 4 years. So they're up to about 3 per square kilometer, roughly 1,600 moose last winter, and we would expect 1,900 or so this coming winter. And the population is really young. Most of the moose out there were born since 2012, so they're just getting into their prime reproductive age, and they'll be reproducing for another 5 to 10 years. And nothing's going to stop them, probably, except perhaps predation, if it was restored. Next slide. So that's the balsam fir story. We can also tell a story for aspen, and I'll just show one slide here at the Daisy Farm campground, right at the base of the dock. There's right in the middle of the photo. There's a big green aspen tree, and aspen reproduced by root sprouts, and surrounding that one big tree are literally dozens, maybe 100 or 200 sprouts of aspen that all came up in the late 1980s, roughly the same time that fir was released at the West End. Aspen was released at the East End, and actually all over the island. And aspen grows really fast, so it has a better chance of outgrowing moose than fir trees. So we got balsam fir, aspen trees showing this classic trophic cascade. Next slide. And then the aquatic story is really very interesting. Again, totally unexpected, but moose are really well adapted for feeding on aquatic plants. In fact, their long nose is thought to exist, have evolved so that they can feed efficiently on underwater plants. And that long nose has lots of ligaments and muscles which allow them to close their nose off consciously. without having hands and feet to help them. So a moose can simply shut off its nostrils, which is something you and I cannot do, which means they can feed underwater much more readily. So beginning in 2006, we started noticing some beaver ponds were being taken over by this green floating plant, which we eventually figured out was water shield. So in the lower right inset shows water shield literally covering the entire water surface of a pond. And this is a really edible, high protein, high sodium plant that moose and beaver both really relish. So it didn't take long for moose and beaver to both start feeding on this, and but the plant grows really fast and took over 5 ponds completely. So it covered the entire water surface up to a certain depth, and by 2013, you could see the green surface of these ponds literally from space. So Google Earth imagery showed it very nicely. Next slide. In fact, here is Google Earth imagery. This is actually Lake Ojibwe taken during the same season from May to August. But the same thing happened over time. So the plant is underwater initially in May with roots and stems growing up, and then finally it hits the surface in late May and June, and it covered all of Lake Ojibwe out to a depth of about 2 to 3 meters. Next slide. Another investigator, Joseph Bump, and his graduate student, Brenda Bergman, set up some exclosures to keep moose out of small areas in several aquatic areas to demonstrate what would happen if there were no moose and beaver feeding. Next slide. And half of the fence kept out both moose and beaver, and the other half kept out just moose. So beaver had access to the lower part of this circle, but not moose, and then both moose and beaver were excluded from the top part. And there's basically nothing outside that fence in terms of aquatic plants. So it's pretty easy to see the dramatic effect of moose and beaver, but moose take about 10 times more forage than beaver do. Next slide. So these, by 2013 or so, moose had really discovered these lakes, and they were accumulating in large numbers in May and June to feast on these plants. So it's rich in sodium, and protein. It's a safe place. The wolves usually don't swim after moose in the water, and it's cool in the water, and moose are often heat stressed. So there's lots of good reasons for moose to spend time in aquatic areas. Next slide. Well, this had a dramatic effect on the ponds. Basically, the moose simply trashed them. On the slide on the left shows the water quality along the shorelines of one of the heavily used ponds. It's a mixture of moose hair and saliva and urine and feces, and then on the right it just shows a beaver dam that was used by moose to get around, to encircle to walk around the edge of the pond. So everything is kind of reduced to mud and highly turbid water of very poor quality. And that's what I would characterize an aquatic area as if it was trashed, but simply. Next slide. We can put some data on this using Google Earth imagery and also just observations, field notes that we took at these lakes. This shows Lake Ojibwe. 2006, there was no water shield. By 2007, it was 70% covered, and then it maintained that more or less total coverage until 2015. And then moose were increasingly having effects on water shield. And then in the last 2 years, they've basically eaten all of it, all of the surface plants. And we can complicate this by showing all the other 4 ponds. So we can, next slide shows all the data. And the last slide there, the last data point in 2017 shows all 5 ponds down essentially at 0. No water shield left. Whereas 5 years ago, they were all maximally covered by this green plant. Next slide. Oh, just more details. How do we measure water shield? You know, you can take an aerial picture that shows the whole lake, upper left, and then zoom in closer and closer to the point where on the upper right shows a detailed image showing roughly a meter stick, and so you can envision how many leaves per square meter there are. And you notice in the upper right, it's mostly muddy water and relatively few plants. This year, you would see just muddy water, no green plants at all. Next slide. Moose have such a dramatic intake rate that they probably outcompete beaver. And this is probably what's happening here in this pond, where in 2011, you can see green water shield over most of the pond, and that the appearance of water shield allowed beaver to recolonize this pond. They'd abandoned the site for many years, but because they eat water shield, they came back and built up a new colony and were munching on water shield very nicely, as were moose. But by 2016, moose had essentially eaten all the water shield. The beaver are gone, the house is overgrown with grass, and this has happened at several of these ponds where water shield formerly could be found. Next slide. So this just summarizes the timeline for this whole story. One wolf showed up in 1997, renewed the genetic integrity of the wolf population. Then between 2005 and 10, wolf predation hit an incredibly high level, and that reduced moose and allowed aquatic recovery and terrestrial recovery. And the immediate future of that recovery is up for grabs. We don't know, because the outcome depends on what the moose population does in the next few years. And that depends on the National Park Service. In 2015, the National Park Service began an environmental impact study, an EIS process, to determine what they were going to do about the disappearing wolf population. And they expect to make a final decision late in 2017. That's this year. So it should be imminent. The short story to this entire presentation, the so what line at the bottom, is that it really matters a lot to the ecological integrity of Isle Royale whether or not there are wolves present. And so the preliminary preferred alternative for the National Park Service, which they published last December, is to restore a new wolf population. And so we'll see if they finally make that decision, and then how fast they can carry it out. So that's it for the formal presentation. Now I'd be very interested to see what questions you might have.
Absolutely, and we do have quite a few, so I'm going to go through them pretty quickly here. I'm going to put the spotlight over here. And the first question we have is, could you explain more about the effects of genetic inbreeding?
Oh yeah, it happens in all plants and animals, as far as we know. When two close relatives reproduce, if whatever recessive lethal genes or recessive detrimental genes they might have tend to show up with both chromosomes having the same recessive gene, and it can be fatal or at least deleterious. So we know that in people, mating beyond first cousins tends to produce offspring with lowered viability. In fact, Charles Darwin married his cousin, and he had 11 children, I think. And they weren't terribly good health, and some of them died early. And he wondered to himself mostly whether marrying his cousin had anything to do with the rather poor viability in his own kids. So it doesn't mean that the wolves themselves are full of deformities or deleterious genes. It's just that when two very close relatives mate, that's the tends to be the universal outcome, because all individuals have 3, 4, 5, 6 deleterious genes, maybe fatal recessive genes, and those are the ones that cause the problems.
Excellent. And Hope asks, well, firstly, she thanks you for presenting your data to us and sharing your experiences here. They also asked, with the inbreeding and the genetic issues that we faced on Isle Royale before, would introducing a new population continue that? Would that be likely to occur again with a new population?
Oh, sure. In the absence of ice bridges, it'd be a recurring problem, but it's not a terribly difficult problem to deal with. In the past, every 20 to 30 years, a new breeding wolf is required. That's it. I mean, that's a pretty easy fix to maintain a national park. You can contrast that intervention with what I just witnessed myself in the Canadian Maritimes. There's 5 national parks stretching from Newfoundland to Cape Breton Island that have 3 to 5 moose per square kilometer, and no wolves and no bears and no hunting. And those moose are basically trashing the forest in combination with spruce budworm, which took out the tree canopy, and then moose preventing any regeneration. What they see now is literally thousands of hectares of former forest that's reverted to grass. And so the Parks Canada has a major public campaign with the logo, Bring Back the Boreal. They're literally trying to plant trees in order to maintain the forests of those parks, and they're also killing moose. They're trying to kill moose through shooting, which is a pretty controversial move for a national park. So they're taking it very seriously, and they believe that to maintain the ecological integrity of those parks, they've got to have fewer moose. And wolves are not considered a serious option for those areas because of public opposition. So I can tell you it costs millions of dollars, or you can just have wolves. It's pretty easy economic choice, I think.
Thank you. Catherine, Robert, and a few others have asked, if wolves are reintroduced to the island, what's the number of wolves that would be needed to introduce to sort of balance the ecosystem of what's going on out there?
Well, you wouldn't have to put very many wolves on there. You basically just have to reseed the island with wolves that will self-organize and produce breeding pairs and territorial packs. And there's undoubtedly room for 2 or 3 territorial packs, because that's what we've had for most of the last 60 years. So it'd be primarily a matter of seeding the island with pairs that are either coming preformed, or pairs that would form from wolves released on the island. And then depending on how they organized and reproduced, you might want to drop a few more non-relatives in there over the next few years to give it a longer run time. So essentially you'd be producing, and I mean, this is the preferred alternative, at least in the National Park Service, was to introduce a number of wolves, more than what would normally occur during natural immigration, and maximize genetic diversity so that it can run for a longer period of time.
Excellent.
So how many? 10 or 15 is the plan.
Okay, excellent. And sort of on the other side of the coin, we have a question about moose. Um, with the large moose population, would it be possible or feasible to do a moose roundup or capture and release on areas in the mainland with the moose population in decline on the
Feasible, but only at enormous cost. You'd have to think about, moving 100 to 200 moose every year, more or less indefinitely, at a cost of thousands of dollars per moose. In the case of Parks Canada, literally it cost them to shoot 50 moose with all the security and helicopters necessary and so forth. It cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. And 50 moose wouldn't even do the job at Isle Royale, where there are no roads, by the way, and no place to helicopter a moose to. So logistically, it would be impossible to round up moose or even shoot them in a way that would be regarded as ethical by the American public.
All right, excellent. Marianne asks, is M93 the last new wolf to arrive on Isle Royale?
Yeah, M93 is the only wolf to arrive on Isle Royale in the last 25 years. I should point out, when we've had ice bridges, people have tended to think, wow, all we need is an ice bridge, everything will be fine. And we've actually had 3 ice bridges since 2008. And because of the genetic relationships among the wolves, what we've seen happen when we do have an ice bridge recently is the wolves just leave. They want out of Isle Royale because they want to find an unrelated mate. So they run off Isle Royale as fast as they can. And of course, they don't know about guns. And in one case, a wolf literally was shot almost hitting the mainland within a half mile, is dead. So they don't have much of a future on the mainland.
Of the possible wolf recovery options provided in the draft of the AIS, which would you support as most beneficial to Isle Royale recovery and management of the moose population?
Well, the preliminary plan published last year by the Park Service had 4 alternatives. One is always to do nothing. The other 3 involved one that would do nothing right away, just kind of watch and see what happens and preserve the option to intervene later. And then the other 2 involved intervene. And one had a larger level of initial introduction, 20 to 30 wolves within 3 to 5 years, if necessary. And then after 5 years, nothing would be done during the life of that plan, which is roughly 20 years. So 5 years of significant intervention, significant introduction of wolves, and then no intervention. And then the last alternative was to just kind of start slow, 8 to 10 wolves, and then see how it goes. If they need more, add more, and then do whatever is necessary to maintain a viable wolf population for the 20-year lifespan of the plan. Either of those options that involve adding wolves would work. And the rationale for the Park Service to choose the one where they intervene kind of in a big way for 3 to 5 years and then hands off, that's fine. And their goal, I think, was to get the wolf population very quickly up to the average level where it's been for the last several decades, and also to maximize genetic diversity right at the outset. So that's fine. They just have to do it.
Excellent. Ron asks that with the smaller wolf population, you now have young moose who have not had a lot of experience evading wolves, and they'll be having calves as well. Would you expect that with a reintroduction, I believe that he's alluding to, would you expect that they would learn pretty quickly if the wolves are reintroduced to the island, and that they'd adapt to having predators on the landscape again?
I think they would adapt pretty fast, but there will be some losers. And the ones, you think about, basically wolves haven't been around much for the last 5 years. So there are probably beaver in Isle Royale that have never seen a wolf. And we have seen a lot of activity of beavers far, far from their pond, much farther than they used to go when they had to worry about wolves. So, and we've also seen, especially this year, moose calves that aren't very close to their mothers. And that'll change really fast as soon as wolves show up. So we would expect that new wolves arriving on Isle Royale would do really well, even if they're not familiar with moose, because they're going to find calves that aren't well tended by their mothers, and they're going to find beavers 50 meters from their ponds, which is a pretty easy situation for a wolf. So, I think I've been interested in how fast prey behavior sort of devolved to not worry about predators anymore. But we also know from the Northern Rockies, when wolves were returned to Yellowstone and Tetons, it took just one bad experience, one lost calf, and a female moose was completely on it once again. Even though there'd been no wolves for 50 years, she very quickly understood, okay, times have changed and we've got to do this anti-predator thing again. So we would expect prey behavior to change pretty dramatically.
Thank you. Hope asks, instead of reintroducing wolves, would management of the populations be possible, such as hunting and what have you?
Well, hunting is what Parks Canada has had to do in the 5 parks in the Maritimes that have lots of moose and no wolves and no bears, and it's extremely expensive. I think Parks Canada spent $13 million over 5 years to do the research on the plants and to come up with a strategy for what their target moose density should be. And that was before they did anything. And now they're culling moose with special hunts, all of them involving helicopters to one extent or another, to get hunters in off the roads where they need to remove moose and then get carcasses out. So we're talking thousands of dollars per animal removed. And Isle Royale, you have no roads, so it would be really hard to figure it out logistically. And you'd be in it for forever. So that's a pretty untenable management option, I think, when you've got a fairly easy alternative.
Excellent. And Keith asks, are there coyotes on Isle Royale? And if so, what is their impact?
There were coyotes present on Isle Royale for the first half of the 20th century. And the last coyote track was seen about 7 years after wolves showed up. So wolves basically killed them all. It's the only place I know of where wolves completely eradicated coyotes. And they do the same thing to foxes. They try to eradicate foxes, but the size difference is so great that wolves aren't very efficient at killing foxes. So the foxes actually did better, we think, after wolves colonized the island, because they got rid of the coyotes, and the coyotes were impacting fox numbers by direct killing as well. So the three canids, the big ones, the gray wolves, the medium-sized ones, the coyotes, and the red foxes. That's a small one. The big ones tend to limit and kill the smaller ones, and that's what wolves did to the coyote.
All right. And Robert asks, so what subspecies would be needed for this introduction? Could something like the Mexican wolf be used, or would it have to be a subspecies native to the general area?
Well, the geneticists have weighed in on this question, and they argue to use wolves close at hand. And if you go too far afield, you have the potential of seeing a phenomenon called genetic outbreeding, outbreeding depression, pardon me, where the genes are so unlike that you have problems as a result of that. So, yeah, the option of dragging Yellowstone wolves over and dumping them off at Isle Royale did not seem to, from a genetic standpoint, to be a very smart move. So the wolves right on the adjacent mainland or anywhere in the Lake Superior region would be the logical candidates.
Excellent. Since it is somewhat difficult for just two wolves to kill a moose, have you seen any evidence of the wolves preying more on beaver when in such low numbers?
Well, two wolves actually do a pretty good job killing moose and certainly beaver. The two wolves that were left this past winter, I think we recorded 5 kills or five dead moose. Let's see, one of them was an adult cow, and three of them were moose calves, and one was an adult bull that just starved to death, and they ate that one too. But so they're able to kill adults. They just have to be to shop around quite a bit until they find a really run down old moose with infirmities, and that's what they have to do anyway. And moose calves are relatively vulnerable. So the two wolves that are left really have no food challenges. They're both old, experienced wolves, and yeah, they're doing just fine. We don't know that they're feeding any more on beaver than they used to, but they certainly have the opportunity to feed on beaver most of the year now.
Excellent. And Katie asks, if wolves are reintroduced to the island, will the current wolf on Isle Royale likely remain?
The Park Service in their EIS wrote that the presence of the native wolf population is not really relevant to the intervention that they initially favored. It would matter. I mean, in terms of planning an introduction, you would want to pay some attention to whether or not there were 1 or 2 native wolves left. And from a standpoint of learning about genetics of small populations, it would be very useful, very scientifically useful to provide whatever wolf was left. Say it's the female, provide her with a new option for a mate. And we would expect that if she had the opportunity to mate with a non-relative, everything would be just fine. So that would be a test of genetic rescue. But that the job wouldn't be done if, at that point you'd still want to, depending on which option the National Park Service chose, you'd still want to go further and introduce at least a second breeding pair and a third if you could figure it out. So, but the main thing is to get wolves there that would figure things out on their own. They have to self-organize, and so people think, well, maybe this is too heavy-handed. You're determining the outcome of this national park. Not by a long shot. No, you're just giving wolves a chance to do what wolves do, and there's really no way to even predict exactly the way they're going to manage it.
Excellent. Merrily asks, does anyone do regular beaver population counts?
Yeah, ever since about 1964, there's been an aerial count of active beaver colonies from aircraft in October. And actually we did it every year from 2006 to 2010. So basically every other year, an aerial count of active beaver sites.
Thank you. And Linda is asking, is there anybody opposing the reintroduction of additional wolves to Isle Royale?
There are wilderness advocates. I would say it's a fairly extreme view of wilderness management, but there are wilderness advocates that do oppose any intervention in a designated wilderness for any reason, forever. And whatever happens, happens. Whether there's people that have messed up the system or limited options for that ecosystem or not, there are some people that are just adamant that you should never, ever intervene in a designated wilderness. Ignoring the fact that we're intervening all the time inadvertently.
Excellent. Susan is asking, could artificial insemination be used to refresh the gene pool if inbreeding does become a problem in the future after this reintroduction?
In theory, yeah. Artificial insemination has been used a very few times in captive situations, and it's very intensive management. I mean, you have to basically know exactly when a female is in heat, and that may only be 24 hours. And then you have to have a male ready to go, a male which is acceptable to the female. I mean, you can see how you might be able to do it in captivity. I can't imagine doing it in the wild. So better just let them figure it out. Provide a female with a suitable male, and they will figure it out.
Excellent. And Marianne is asking, was M93's dramatic reproductive success unusual for a newly introduced or newly arrived wolf?
Yeah, how unusual was M93? It's hard to know. We certainly had wolves that reproduced as well in previous years and previous decades. So, and we didn't actually see anything unusual going on during those years when M93 was present and breeding. And I should underscore, we didn't even know there was anything unusual going on until 2008, when we analyzed the backlog of genetic material from scats that we'd collected ever since 1999. So we didn't even know M93 existed or was anything unique until it'd been dead for 2 years. So it's only in retrospect, putting together the family tree and the pedigree of wolves from fecal DNA, that we figured out the whole story. So we weren't seeing anything unusual in the late 90s or early 2000s, except that there were white wolves starting to show up. And now we know those were offspring from M93. As they got old, they tended to turn white. But we thought, well, maybe it's just effects of inbreeding, or we just never crossed our minds that, gosh, this was a brand new wolf that had showed up and spread genes throughout the population. So now the increased predation rate that followed the spread of M99's genes, that is really remarkable, and it does suggest that genetic renewal caused that increase in predation pressure. And I bring that up only to point out that just sticking wolves back on Isle Royale doesn't mean that everything just falls back into the same pattern that we've been seeing for the last 50 years. There could be something fundamentally very different about a new wolf-moose dynamic. And M99 was sort of the indicator that might happen.
Excellent. And Hope mentions that other researchers have advocated for a hands-off approach with regards to the island. Do you have a particular reaction to this position?
Yeah, I don't agree. They may have reasons that are well supported, or they may have reasons that aren't well supported. But no, I don't agree that a hands-off approach is good at this point for science or for preservation of the integrity of the national park.
Thank you. Tom and Lori are asking, how long do you think it will be before vegetation would return to more, more regular or less browse levels?
Yeah, vegetation. Every species of plant will be different. With water shield, it's basically all gone now. but I don't think the plant itself is going to disappear. It's always, I think, present in low abundance in aquatic systems, small ponds. Balsam fir is a critical one because it's sort of the signature tree of the boreal forest, but it grows very slowly, and I don't know if they're going to be able to persist in the face of increasing moose. And just restoring wolves isn't going to just suddenly turn that moose population around. And so, it's a big roll of the dice. Every year without wolves is, reduces the probability that balsam fir will persist. Aspen is in much better shape just because it grows very fast. So every species of plant is going to have a different story. But people, hikers to Isle Royale have noticed this year and remarked on the fact that the forest just looks like a razor came in and shaved it off at about 2 meters high. So it is fairly noticeable.
Thank you. And Keith is asking, have bears ever populated Isle Royale, or what role would they have if they, do you think what role would they have if they were on the island at this time?
There's no archaeological record or historical record of bears being present on Isle Royale. It would make a pretty big difference because when you add that second predator, and bears will kill moose calves, tends to knock moose density down a notch. But it's really hard to predict because Isle Royale also has a lot of greenery available about the time moose calves are born. So at this latitude, and Minnesota may be an indicator too, bears are not the heavy predator of moose calves that they are further north, where, third week of May when the calves are dropped in Alaska, there's nothing green out there for bears to eat. So they really gravitate towards moose calves. At this latitude, Minnesota, Isle Royale, there's a lot of greenery, a lot of new sprouts that are high in protein and favored by bears. So it would make a difference, but I'm not sure it would knock moose down to a dramatically lower level. And without a historic precedent for bears' presence on Isle Royale, they wouldn't, by National Park Service policy, be a candidate for introduction. Now, could they get there on their own? Well, sure, but they have to swim there, and they haven't done it yet. But it may be just dumb luck that they haven't made it. It's a long swim, but bears can swim, and they have a lot of fat and could maybe survive the cold water. And the water's getting warmer. So now, of course, it has to be not just one bear, but a reproducing pair. So, it just hasn't happened yet.
All right, excellent. We have only just a few minutes here left, so I'm going to jump around in the questions a little bit to make sure everybody's got an opportunity to ask a question. Ron is asking if the female wolf that had not died giving birth a few years ago and the 3 wolves that had fallen into the mine shaft not have died, do you believe that would have delayed the problems of inbreeding, or should those new younger animals have invigorated some of the genetics that he's alluding to?
Well, in 2011, 3 wolves did die in a mine shaft. Probably when the ice gave way after the 3rd wolf jumped down this hole. Maybe they were after a snowshoe hare or something, but all 3 of those wolves died, including one young female who was a sister of the surviving female now. She'd probably still be alive now. And having a second female, it doubles the potential for reproduction. The female that died giving birth, that was in 2009, I believe. That was the end of the East Pack. Had those pups survived, they were heavily inbred because the mother had mated with her father. So those 8 pups probably didn't have a real good chance at survival. But the 3 that went down the mine shaft were descendants of an important female wolf that was the last native female that contributed genetically to the two survivors. So otherwise, all the genes are from M99 or his female offspring, with the exception of this one female who died in 2003. If she hadn't been involved in the pedigree, the family tree of these wolves, they may not have made it as long as they have, actually.
All right, excellent. We have just a few more questions left. Maureen asks, is there a time frame for this introduction? Are they still leaning towards a 2018-2019 season, or has that changed? And also, on a second note, have seedlings been planted where extreme browsing and destruction by moose have taken place?
Let's see. Repeat the second part of seedlings.
Yeah, if they were, have there been any seedlings planted by people for the overbrowsed areas by moose?
Oh, no. Answering the second question first, there's been no planting of trees at all. Parks Canada has been doing that, but not at Isle Royale. And I should point out that Parks Canada tree planting exercises are sort of under a research umbrella. They're trying to figure out how to prepare the site, prepare the soil for the maximum survival and reproduction of seedlings that are planted. So there's a strong research component, but I mean, it's bucking tremendous trends when you think you're going to replant a forest in a national park and hope that it comes back to something resembling what it used to be. It's a pretty daunting challenge. It's certainly expensive. First part of the question again was?
That's no problem. She was asking, is the forecasted introduction, should this be approved in the 2018-2019 season, or has that changed?
There's nothing in writing about a timetable. There's no implementation plan that one can go look at, and no commitment about timetable whatsoever. So hopefully somebody's thinking about that within the National Park Service.
Excellent. Well, we're running just a little bit over time, so I think I'm just going to ask one last question. Tricia is asking, is there anything that the public can do or should do towards the reintroduction of Royal, such as a support or petition or anything of that sort?
Well, I think there's following the publication of the final draft EIS, in which the National Park Service announces its final decision, there's a 60-day period, and I'm not sure if it's a waiting period or if it's a public comment period. But certainly, but at any point, the public can weigh in and contribute. Certainly, if there's a public comment period, there'll be a website and an opportunity to weigh in. And the purpose of those public comments is to reveal any shortcomings of the EIS or provide new data if there's important new information that hasn't been considered. It's not a vote, but it still has been pretty influential. And thousands of people have commented formally during the EIS, and 85 to 90% of those people argue that there should be wolves on Isle Royale. So with that kind of overwhelming public support for wolves on Isle Royale, the Park Service did respond and narrow down its decision process to a small subset of the questions that it started out with in 2015. So the public has been an important influence throughout. So there's nothing that says you can't at any point write a letter or send a message to the superintendent of Isle Royale National Park and provide your opinion. And it's always good to send a copy to your congressional representatives at the same time.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Rolf. I think we're going to wrap it up there. We're just a little bit over time. So, again, we want to thank you very much for spending time with us, sharing your experience and your data with us. We had over 70 participants in our webinar tonight, and they all seemed to get a lot of questions in. So, thank you very much for your time, and we hope to work with you again in the future.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. We'll see you all next time. Thank you all very much for coming. We're going to sign out now. And again, thank you, Rolf, and thank you to the audience that supported this program. We'll see you all later.
Good evening.